Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just double checking everybody who's online can hear me. Please write something in the chat if you can't. I have it open here in front of me. And good morning to Chile, and good evening to everyone who's joining us. Further to the east in time zones. So welcome, everyone. It's lovely to have you here. Welcome to this dialogue on fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. This is essentially a session that's going to review a little bit of the science behind the negotiations at the WTO, which of course are now continuing. You can hear me. And the key decisions that were taken in the context of those negotiations up until the June ministerial. So I think I know almost everyone here, but if there's anyone online who I haven't met, my name's Alice. I lead ISD's work on trade policy, including on fisheries subsidies, and I'm accompanied by my colleagues Tristan Ischlinger and Eleonora Bonacorsi. So Tristan is actually going to help with the delivery of some of the substance of this session, and Eleonora is helping to manage all of the technology superbly and to manage the online room. So those of you who are online, please feel just as welcome as if you were here. And in fact, on the registration list, I've seen a number of people who aren't based in Geneva and who might be less familiar with IISD and with us. So I'll beg the patience of those of you who know us very well, just to explain to anyone who's new who we are and what we do. So the ISD is a non-profit think tank. We're based in Canada, but we have an office in Geneva from which our trade team does its work. So we work on fisheries subsidies, but also on agricultural trade, on food security, trade and the environment, including plastics, fossil fuel subsidies, digital trade, investment facilitation. It's actually a very wide team with a wide range of interests. So what can you expect from us and what can you expect from this dialogue? You can expect impartial, objective, evidence-based analysis. We're not here to tell you what your national positions should be or to advocate for a specific outcome, but we are here to give all WTO members analysis and evidence that we think will be useful in generating a constructive and evidence-based discussion amongst you all about how to meet the various mandates that you've set for yourselves. That said, we're not, I have to say, normatively neutral. If we're engaging in a topic like this and continuing to engage, it's because we really want there to be an outcome and want there to be a really good outcome that supports sustainable development. So it's not our role to tell you what that outcome should look like, but to give you the evidence and the analysis that we think will help you to negotiate the best deal possible. So these are all informal, off the record learning events. You'll see we are recording the part of the events that is just the presentations, because we think other people will benefit from seeing the presentations and the information delivered. But when we post the recording of this event online, we will remove all of the discussion and the questions and answers. So that is not going anywhere on the internet. It will stay in this room and the online room. If any of you are interested in seeing who's registered to be in the online room, that's fine. We're happy to share that list too, so you know exactly who's in the room. So yes, this is a chance, I guess, and all of our events, I suppose, are a chance for you to ask experts all the questions you would like. We'll have a number of experts presenting in the first part of this. It's a chance for you to ask them all the questions you would rather not ask in the negotiating room. And those questions will not and should not be held against you when you eventually go back into the negotiating room. I am going to ask plenty of really stupid questions of the presenters in an effort to encourage you guys to do the same. And I ask that you not hold my stupid questions against me. So this is the approach that we've been following throughout all of our engagement in the fisheries subsidies negotiations, and it's the same approach we're going to take to this second phase of negotiations. And this, in fact, is the first session we're organizing that focuses specifically on this second phase of negotiations. So we've organized it to complement the session that the WTO Secretariat organized last week, which we hope you found useful. In looking over the agenda as we saw it, we thought there were a couple of things where we could add a little bit more value to that discussion. So this is our attempt to do that. The first thing, before I go on to the rest of the substance, I'm going to have to apologize at the beginning. You don't know this yet, but I actually have a very irritating cough. I have taken 2 COVID tests this morning out of respect for you and your families. It is not COVID, it is just a very irritating cough, but it means that if it overwhelms me, as it did when I was running a webinar yesterday, I'm going to pass my moderator's notes to Tristan while I go outside and deal with my cough, and he's going to have to take over. He really hopes that doesn't happen. And so do I. You'll be fine. So forgive me if it happens, I will have to just duck out rather than splutter all over you. So, but don't worry, it's not COVID. Okay, so back to the substance. You'll have seen on the agenda, there's essentially 2 sessions for this afternoon. The first one, session 1, looks at the research that's been done into subsidies and their effects, and looks back at some of the research that really inspired much of the discussion in the overcapacity and overfishing pillar. It informed, I think, the discussion about what subsidies the agreement should prohibit, which it should allow, and in what circumstances. And the second topic in session 2 looks back at the main approaches that were suggested for the prohibition and the special and differential treatment part of Article 5, the overcapacity and overfishing pillar. And it gives you, I think, a sort of a more systemic review of those different approaches, their advantages and disadvantages, at least as we see them, and a review of the key decisions that were taken in the lead up to the 10th of June text that went into MC12. So it helps, we hope, you to see where we got, how we got to where we got to, so you can decide if you want to take the same route or not. So that's the 2 sessions. We are going to take a short health break in the middle of those 2 sessions. In particular, for those of you who are watching this online, we know that 3 hours is a very long time to sit and stare at your screens. It's a bit easier if you're in person, but we will take a break between those 2 steps, just to let you go and stretch your legs. Okay. So with all of that introduction and apologies done, let's start. So session 1 is about understanding the existing research on the impact of fisheries subsidies. And this research goes back a very long way, but it's also constantly evolving. So what's kind of fun about this session is that we get to bring you up to date with some information that was only just declassified yesterday. So it's quite timely. So we're going to hear from 3 experts who know this science and know this research extremely well. We're going to hear from Professor Rashid Soumaila, who I hope is online already. I'll have a look at my list. So Professor Soumaila, many of you will have heard of him and know him very well. Where many of you will also have heard of Professor Soumaila's database on subsidy numbers. We're not going to be talking about that today. What we've asked Rashid to explain is the economics behind the study of fishery subsidies and their impact, and to explain particularly how the University of British Columbia developed their own categorization, which many of you will be familiar with, of which subsidies are harmful to fish stocks and which are not. We're then going to hear from Jayasuriya Kalakal, who's an environment and trade consultant at UNEP, based in Paris. And we've invited UNEP because UNEP developed way back in 2004, but also with subsequent updates, a further categorization of subsidies and their impacts, and their likely effects in different circumstances. So we'll hear a review of UNEP's view of that work. And then we're going to hear from Claire Delpoche, who joins us in person in the room, also from Paris. She's head of Unit of Fisheries and Aquaculture at the OECD. And this is the bit where we hear about the very recent thinking, so recent that Claire only managed to get it declassified by OECD members yesterday. So she'll tell us about the OECD's models and their most recent work on understanding the effects of different subsidies and their current thinking about the degree of risk that can be associated with different subsidies in different circumstances. So I'm going to pause, because that's a lot of information. I'm going to pause very briefly at the end of each of the presentations, the 3 of them, just in case there are questions of clarification, something you missed or something you didn't hear correctly or something you'd like them to repeat, just to make sure everyone understands the information before it gets lost in the next presentation. And then we have a good amount of time at the end for discussion and questions and answers. So this is again the moment you can ask the experts questions you don't want to ask in the negotiating room. So those of you in the room, I know you all, you can just put your hands up if you'd like the floor. For those of you online, we can also see you and hear you. So if you would like to put your hands up and take the floor, I can see you as you put your hands up here. So I'm happy to give the floor to you for questions of clarification, but also in the discussion itself. And if you do take the floor, it would be nice if you could put your camera on just so we can see you, and you can introduce yourselves, but you don't have to if you don't want to. If you'd like to put questions also in the chat box, those of you online, go ahead. If you feel a little bit too shy to take the floor, that's fine. Put your question in the chat box and I'll weave it into the discussion as we go along. Okay. Super. Let me double check. Do we have Rashid online? Not yet. No. Okay. In that case, Jaya Surya, if you're online and ready, would you like to go first?
Sure, Alice, no problem. I'm just gonna try and share my screen. Is that you see a full screen presentation? Just confirming that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Maybe you just need to zoom out a bit so that we can see the full slide.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, exactly. Now it works. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so thank you, Alice. A very good afternoon to everyone in the room and online. First of all, I would like to thank IISD for having me here. It's my pleasure to be able to present on behalf of UNEP and in this very timely and important workshop. I have a long presentation, so I'll jump right in. But just to begin with a bit of background on the work I will present today. Back in 2004, soon after the Doha Ministerial Declaration recognized the new rules for recognized the need for the new rules for fish subsidy, UNEP produced a number of pieces of analysis on resource impacts of fishery subsidies. And this work was spearheaded by Mr. Gareth Porter. And in the following 10 years, there were several discussions around these analytical pieces that were conducted. And this includes discussions on sustainability criteria for fish subsidies based on another piece of work that UNEP produced with WWF in 2009. And the agreement on the new disciplines of fish subsidies this June at the WTO is arguably the first one of its kind with environmental objectives at the center of it. And important outstanding issues concerning subsidies leading to overfishing and overcapacity remain to be negotiated. So in this context, I hope that UNEP's past work, although admittedly 18 years old, has some relevance to date in efforts to ensure that fishery subsidies are subjected to meaningful limits in order to ensure long-term sustainability for the resources, but also the food security and employment from this sector. And with that, I want to start with what the analysis does. It takes what we call a matrix approach that ensures systematic coverage of the relevant combinations of subsidy types and characteristics of fishery and its management regimes to look at the impacts on fish resources. It is designed to serve as an analytical basis for designing new or improved disciplines on fishery subsidies to protect fishery resources. Now, while the study looks at the resource impacts, what it doesn't look at is the other environmental impacts, which should also be borne in mind, that emerges from increased fishing efforts. So this could be increased bycatch, marine pollution, damage to habitats from the fishing gear, and so on. And another aspect that this analysis doesn't look at is non-resource impacts, such as impacts on trade or social welfare. So just putting it out there before we go into the analysis. So what is the matrix approach? It is, like I said, an analytical framework that examines the impact of fishery subsidies under different combinations of management parameters and the different degrees of exploitation in a fishery. And for each category of subsidy, the matrix illustrates the impact for each of the three combination of management and capacity related parameters, as you can see on the matrix on the slide. And these impacts were arrived at using real-life case studies from specific subsidy programs that were implemented in different countries and their results, and bioeconomic outcomes based on a simplified fisheries management model also from the literature. So now let's take a look at the two parameters a bit closely. The first one is the degree of exploitation. And for this analysis, we looked at three types: overcapacity, full capacity, and less than full capacity. And the second parameter, which is the management system effectiveness, we looked at three types: effective management, catch controls, and open access. And there are two main assumptions that the study is based on. The first is that even in a management regime with catch controls, but no property rights, the combination of overcapacity, inappropriate quotas, and imperfect monitoring and surveillance leads to a race for fish, which leads to some degree of overexploitation on the fishery. And an effective management regime, therefore, is one that combines scientifically based catch and effort controls, adequate monitoring and surveillance measures, and socioeconomic incentives for sustainable fishing. The second assumption is that the total biomass of commercial fish stocks in an overexploited fishery is not increasing at the time that the subsidy is applied. So this simplified model of impacts says that an increase in effort will inevitably have a negative impact on the fish stocks in a fishery that is already overexploited. And finally, the study also notes that the category of effective management is quite rare in the real world. So with that, we go on to look at the 8 categories of subsidies that the study is looking at. These are fisheries infrastructure subsidies, management services related subsidies, subsidies for access to foreign countries' waters, decommissioning of vessels and license retirement related incentives, subsidies to capital costs, subsidies to variable costs, income support and unemployment insurance, and price support subsidies. So now, based on these parameters and subsidy types, we see on the slide the results of what the impact on fish resources was found to be, and the NH, H, and PH that you see on the matrix basically stands for not harmful, harmful, and potentially harmful. And arguably, it's a simplified model, but it does bring us to one important conclusion, which is that only under effective management conditions do fishery subsidies end up being not harmful for the fish stocks. And we look at this a bit more in detail. But let's look at the first column under the effective management section here first. And under this, the case of less than full capacity can be, we can put that aside because it's not very relevant for this exercise because under this combination of effective management, this would only be in place when the fisheries are already fully capitalized or overcapitalized. So let's already begin with the overcapacity situation. Where there is overcapacity, but along with it, both effective catch controls and property rights or community-based management or some other means of eliminating economic incentives to overfish exists, there would not remain this condition of an overcapitalized fleet for very long. And this is because the fishers would have an incentive to reduce overall capacity to a level compatible with maximum profitability. Therefore, this combination would exist for a relatively short amount of time. And that leaves us the case of a fishery that does have full capacity and the combination of effective controls and property rights or community-based management. So in that case, a subsidy would not have any negative impact on the level of capacity or effort according to the model that is followed in the study. And if overall quotas are set at a level of maximum economic yield and each vessel has an individual quota assured, the fishing industry would be motivated to replace the existing capacity with more efficient fleets, but not increase the total effort. And in this case, the subsidies would lead to an increase in the profits for the fishers, but not necessarily in the output itself. So that was the effective management category. Now for the other two scenarios where some catch controls are implemented or no catch controls exists, 5 types of subsidies circled on the slide here have been found to be either probably harmful or harmful. This is to say that these 5 categories of subsidies can be harmful to fishery resources under conditions found in a vast majority of the fisheries today. And due to the limited amount of time, I would be focusing on 2 of these, which is subsidies to capital costs and subsidies to variable costs, for a more in-depth understanding of why these are deemed to be harmful. So let's start with subsidies to capital costs. By definition, these subsidies are used only for the purchase of fishing vessels, new fishing gear, motors or engines, and so on. And unlike other categories of subsidies, which may have an indirect effort on fishing capacity, this type of subsidy causes a direct increase in fishing capacity by definition. And we already looked at the mechanism behind the effective management scenario in the last slide. So let's begin directly with the catch control regime here. The likely impact of subsidies on capital costs of fishing effort in a catch control management system varies according to the bioeconomic conditions of the fishery. In the case of overcapacity and full capacity, a fishery with stocks that have already been severely depleted and that have stringent limits on days at sea and seasonal closures is likely to experience less net increase in fishing effort because of capital subsidies as compared to a fishery that is already has full capacity but does not have any severe effort restrictions. Now, on the other hand, the greater the level of overcapitalization, the more challenging it is to effectively manage the fisheries. So this limits the effectiveness of effort restrictions in protecting against even higher levels of fish mortality in already overexploited stocks. So under all 3 bioeconomic scenarios, these kind of subsidies would be deemed harmful. Now, in the open access scenario, if neither effective catch controls nor appropriate incentives exist in a fishery, the purpose of subsidies must be to increase the level of fleet capacity. In such a regime, even if the fishery is less than fully exploited, such subsidies are likely to cause an overshoot in fleet capacity well beyond a biologically sustainable level. Subsidies to capital costs are likely to encourage the adoption of much more powerful fishing technologies, causing the capacity level to grow so much that the fishery shifts from less than fully exploited to seriously overexploited in a short amount of time. So this results in unintended damages to the fish stocks, even if you started off with a underexploited fishery. Now, that was capital cost. Let's move on to the subsidies to variable costs. So subsidies to variable costs include all those that reduce actual operating costs of fishing vessels. In general, reducing these costs through a subsidy makes each fishing trip less expensive. So subsidies to fuel, for example, may affect the level of fishing capacity indirectly through what is known as the technology effect. That is, it provides an incentive for vessel owners to use more powerful fuel-consuming engines and induce, for example, more use of refrigeration on vessel by making it more profitable. Under the catch control regime here, in case of an overexploited fishery, catch control systems alone have not been able to prevent significant quota violations from a practical experience. The failure of such control systems is even more likely when fleet overcapacity in the fishery increases. Therefore, the effect of subsidies to variable costs is only partially mitigated by the existence of catch control systems. So when the capacity is already greater than or close to what is required to exploit the resources at a sustainable level, a subsidy to variable costs will carry a high risk of degrading the fish stocks. Now, in an underexploited fishery, this category of subsidy is not very likely to cause harm to the resources. But the potential for the overshoot effect because of the technology increase is always there. So that's something to be careful about. Now, finally, under the open access regime, in case of a full or overcapacity, the impact of subsidies to variable costs is particularly damaging to resources when they have indirect effects on the technology choices and occur in fisheries that are already fully or nearly fully exploited. And in a clearly underexploited fishery, again, this category of subsidy would not necessarily harm the resources in the short run, but in the long run, the potential for the technology effect to take over is quite likely. So similarly, the explanation behind why each of the subsidy categories is considered harmful is explained in the report from UNEP. And I invite you to have a look at this in your own time. But following from this analysis, UNEP and WWF then suggested 3 basic criteria for determining when it is sustainable for subsidies to be provided. That is, when they don't cause harm to the fishery resources. And these criteria were stock-related criteria, capacity-related criteria, and management-related criteria. The analysis then looked at each of these in more detail and suggested some potential provisions, if you want. You will see that there are 3 levels of ambition: best practices, minimum recommended levels, and minimum international requirements. And in the interest of time, I will not be going into this, but I will share my slides, and in the annex, you will find exactly what these suggested provisions are. And I hope that it will be helpful for the preparations for the next round of negotiations. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. I thank you all for your attention. I hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss more in the Q&A session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Claire, go ahead. We'll just pull up your slides.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you very much for the invitation. Much appreciated. Also on a day which made me, available to present recent work. So that's really, really kind. And good afternoon, everyone. So I think some of what I present will be actually somehow aligned with what was just presented, but you will see we have some nuances in the way we see things. And I'll try also maybe to just step back a little bit with my introduction, just to go back a bit more about why subsidies are there in the first place and help us understand the political economic context in which they operate. Maybe I'm doing something wrong with the pointer. Okay, now it's good. So basically, as you all know, government supports fisheries for many different reasons, right? Sometimes it's to create or to maintain employment in coastal areas. It's to improve fishers' welfare, to ensure the sustainability of fisheries, or to promote food security. There's all kinds of very valid objectives in a way. And they do this through a wide range of policies that benefit individual fishers and companies, but also sometimes that benefit the sector more broadly. So typically, direct support can be given as income support, support for fuel, vessel, and gear, or tax exemptions, whereas, for example, support to the sector might take the form of infrastructure, research, or services like stock management, monitoring, and control at sea. As Alice says, none of this is considered a subsidy at the WTO, and I'm very conscious of that, but we like to refer to this broader context in the OECD because we think that these other policies, which are not subsidies, at least some of them, might actually be very helpful when it comes to designing policy packages that help achieve the goals that governments have for their fisheries, and at the same time conform with the WTO disciplines and the objective of maintaining fisheries in a healthy situation. So why focus on fish stock health, which is the focus of the negotiation? Simply because this is the most important thing for any other objective that governments might have for their fisheries. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind when thinking about the disciplines. You're not doing this only for the fish stocks or for the oceans, but also for your fishers and for future generations of fishers, for your food consumers and future food consumers. Stocks that are not healthy are less abundant and fishing costs go up. So it's not viable and it's not a good option for fisheries to operate in fisheries where the stocks are not healthy. So in a way, the WTO negotiations, I think, has a very clear objective and a very good objective. The question is how you actually implement this objective and how you put in place the disciplines that are needed to eliminate any adverse impact on the fish stocks health. And actually, it is a very difficult challenge for negotiators, but also in a way for researchers. And doing this, even from an academic perspective, is not as easy as one could think. This little infographic tries to represent a fisheries supply chain, and to show all the different places or all the different stages in the supply chains where support might intervene. And actually, you see that support can intervene at the stage of fishing, but also before fishing and after fishing. And all of these types of supports might actually end up having impacts on fishing costs or on fishing benefits. And so they also have an impact on the incentives to go at sea and how much you fish. So that's one first difficulty. If only tracking the money and how it impacts fishing costs and fishing benefits is difficult. What makes it even more difficult is that so those policies impact fishers' decisions, which themselves impact the fish stocks. But the fish stocks are also impacted by other criteria, by climate. And we know that increasingly fish stock abundance or migration patterns are impacted by climate. And they're also impacted by many other marine activities, which have impacts on the ecosystems. So empirically observing the impact of a subsidy on the health of a fish stock is extremely complex. So I think that's one thing we have to recognize. Observing the impacts of subsidy on fish stocks is extremely difficult because many factors are at play. So just like in the previous presentation, I think a lot of the research has actually made use of theoretical models and theoretical work to try and anticipate what might be the potential impact of a subsidy in different circumstances. And I think that's the kind of work that really can help in this negotiation. You are not going to observe the impact of many different types of subsidies in many different consequences, but you can try to anticipate what it might be based on this type of work. So the work that was just presented was one of these papers that I think really informed this discussion. Another one that we have used quite a bit is a model developed by my colleagues, Roger Martini and James Innes, that was called the fish pen model. And this model sort of combines a biological fishery model and an economic model of fisheries. And it looks at 6 types of support. So, slightly less than the previous one. It looks at income support, what they call business and human capital. So that would be support to, for example, how to run a business, but not directly related to your fisheries operations. Support for vessels, for variable inputs, like gear or bait, for example, support to fuel, and support to output. So that would be more like price support, for example. And then they looked at the effects on overfishing, overcapacity, stocks, the tendency to provoke IUU fishing, and also a more socioeconomic dimension, which is the impact on fishers' actual income. It's a rather complicated model, so I won't go into the details for the very reason that I'm not, in the position to explain it very clearly. But I'll try to focus on what we learned from that model, because I think that's the most useful things for the negotiation. So one of the lessons, and I'd like to start with this one, and then I'll try to illustrate it a little bit more, is that we find 4 main factors that actually influence the relative impact of a subsidy on fish stock health. One is the support policy type, so the type of subsidies. The second one, which we've just heard about, is the management framework. And there, I think it's important to flag, as was flagged before, that what matters is the regulation, but also how it's enforced. And that's important. Then there's the initial health of the fish stock, whether the fish stock is already overfished, maybe fully fished, or whether there is scope to fish it more. And then finally is what we call policy design. And actually policy design is simply something that might restrict the eligibility to subsidies to fisheries that might, have different conditions along the 3 other factors. So for example, you could say this subsidy is only available to the small scale sector, or is only available to those fisheries that are well managed or underfished. So something that would restrict, let's say, the scope of the subsidy. So we have these 4 factors that are theoretical factors, but then we also think that 2 of them are actually practically much more important. The first one is that according to the latest FAO global estimates, it seems that only 7.2% of global stocks are underfished. So in a way, I think we can assume that most subsidies actually benefit stocks that are already fully fished, if not overfished. So this kind of caveat, is very unlikely to apply when you give out a subsidy. The second one, which could change, but for now, at least from the evidence that we have in our data, is that subsidies are generally available to all fisheries in one country. So the policy design criteria, I think, is interesting, might become more of a factor in the future if governments decide to make use of that. But let's say that today it isn't really a limiting factor in terms of impact on fish stock health. And I look at the 2 others now in a bit more detail. So the second lesson I would like to illustrate in more detail is the fact that the type of subsidy, of course, is a very important factor in terms of how money is given to the sector and how that might impact the stocks. So here you see some graphs that are taken from the model results I just mentioned a minute ago, which show the impact of subsidies on the abundance of fish stocks according to the type of subsidies. And in the first place, I will focus on the light pink bars, so the bigger ones. And you can see here some variation, right? So for example, support to the use of variable inputs or the use of fuel is greater than the impact of a subsidy to a vessel subsidy in this particular place. It's also much bigger than support to business and human capital. So the type of subsidy matters. The second thing, using the same graph, but now looking at the dark pink bar, the difference between the 2 bars is that the light pink bar is in a situation of open access, so no restriction on how much and how you can fish. The other situation which we looked at is a situation where there is a total allowable catch limit, so a cap on the amount of fish that can be taken. This might be what they refer to as catch control in the previous presentation, except that we would assume that the TAC is set as a scientifically reasonable level, right? So this would be a reasonable and enforced TAC, an effective TAC, if I can say. And of course, you see that there the impact of the subsidy on stocks is much reduced. So there is an impact of management in terms of limiting the harmful effect of subsidies. But you also see that for none of these subsidies, we go to 0. So we wouldn't consider that with a TAC, there is no harmful impact. because, you know, even in the best managed fisheries, illegal fishing is pervasive. There is no fisheries that is perfectly managed. So while I think it's important to recognize the impact of management, it's also important to recognize that there isn't, you know, perfect management. And so the impact doesn't go to zero. And to illustrate this a little bit, I also wanted to share this graph that is from a report that will only come out in a couple of days. But we recently collected data for the 5 most commercially important species in our member countries and those that participate in the work of the OECD Fisheries Committee. So we have 32 countries covered in this data set. And we asked for information about how those key species are managed. And what you see here is the value of landings from those key species in the 32 countries. Depending on whether these species are covered by a total allowable catch limit, partly covered, like some of the stocks of that species are covered, but not the others, or not covered by any total allowable catch limit. And you see that over 30% of the value of landings is actually from species that are not covered by any total allowable catch limit. And this is, of course, data mostly from OECD countries who tend to have capacity to control their fisheries, who also have, like any other country, an interest in managing more intensely those species that are the most commercially valuable, because that's where your value is coming from. So I think this really shows that management is important, but management varies across fisheries, and it shouldn't be taken for granted anywhere. And so bringing all of these elements together, we thought that what might help look at the need for fisheries subsidies reform would be to take a risk perspective. So it's hard to say that one subsidy is fine and another one is harmful, but I think you can say that some subsidies are more risky than others. And so this is what we've tried to summarize on this slide. So to the left, you have the different type of policy support types that we've looked at. And again, this is broader than just subsidies because we look at it as support. So for example, it does include at the bottom management and monitoring, control and surveillance. And then to the right, we try to show the potential risk that those types of subsidies might encourage unsustainable fishing in the absence of effective management. So I think the assumption on the left hand is really that you don't have effective management. And this can be seen as a worst case scenario, sort of framework that helps you anticipate the risk and identify the sort of potentially dangerous subsidies that you might want to look into a bit more. And then at the bottom, you see the policy context, and this recognizes the fact that management, stock health, and policy design can actually limit the risk. And the better management, the better stock health, if policy design is well set, then you go towards lower risk, not no risk, because I think we never have a perfect combination of management and stock health and policy design, but it gets you towards lower risk. And the only thing that we would really qualify as no risk is investment in management and monitoring of the stocks. So basically, the main criteria that we use to define potentially high risk and potentially moderate risk policies is whether the subsidy has a direct impact on fishing costs and fishing benefits. So that would be the high risk. If it has an indirect impact, then it would be moderate risk. And so typically here, income support, we wouldn't qualify as no risk, but as moderate risk, because with income support, you sort of keep in the industry, maybe, fishers for whom fishing wouldn't be profitable. So sometimes it's very limited in time and, the risk is minimum, but if this is repeated, then it creates an incentive that, there will be support the day when, support is needed. And so you have this incentive to remain in the industry, maybe even if it's not necessary. Another type of policy that can be seen as benign, but we think is still moderately risky, would be, for example, support to vessel and gear with very, valid goals, such as reducing environmental impact in the form of emissions, for example. So you would want, I don't know, a vessel that emits less CO2. So in principle, very good objective. But if this means that the fuel costs actually reduce, it means that ultimately your fishing costs also go down. And so that could increase the incentive to go at sea. Maybe one other difference with what we've seen before is we included infrastructure, both in high risk and moderate risk, depending on how it's designed. But just like the previous presenter explained, that if you have more infrastructure, you create capacity for more fishing to take place. So I think it shouldn't be ignored in this analysis. And then there's a couple of policies that we qualified as uncertain risk, because it could really be both ways, right? So for example, research and development, if it's research into the health of fish stock, then it's clearly positive. But then if it's research into more effective technology, even if the intention is not to increase capacity, you might de facto increase capacity. So it's very difficult. You really need details about the policy to understand where it falls. And somehow education and training is the same. If it's, education about, taking better care of the marine environment, then it can be very positive. But if this education actually helps you be more effective as a fisher, then incidentally, it can also create additional pressure on the stocks. And then this last lesson I wanted to bring up, just maybe to provide further motivation for this negotiation, to say that when you actually look at the impact of subsidies on fishers' income, you find that some of these subsidies are actually really poorly helping the fishers. So for example, support for fuel actually largely gets lost to the fuel providers, and also benefits those that receive the most input, the most support, which are those who actually consume the most input. So it's the large scale fleet. And you can get to a situation where this support actually means the stock reduces, and what is left for the small scale segment is reduced. And actually, even though the small scale sector receives fuel support, they actually lose in terms of profitability, because they lose more in terms of fishing a less abundant stock. So I think even though the focus of the negotiation is on the environmental impact of subsidies, pursuing these negotiations will also, in fact, bring some socio-economic benefits to the sector. So that's I think important to keep in mind. And you can also see that the benefits to fisher are actually higher under good management or with a tech in place. So, not only will fishers benefit from better subsidies, but they will also benefit from better management. So by pursuing both, the impact of the subsidies for the fisher will be greater. And finally, this has been really focused on the theory and what we know from the science, but putting this into practice, you also need data, right? And so that's what I just want to quickly refer. So as I said, mid-December, we will be publishing the new edition of our OECD review of fisheries and the database that goes hand in hand with it. And so in there, you can find detailed data on subsidies for 40 countries and economies, which together account for 19% of global lending. So although it's not global, it will give you an idea of subsidies in those countries that represent the vast majority of global lendings in value. And then we also have detailed data on fish stock health at the country level for 32 countries, and data on fish stock management, again, for those same 32 countries. So I do hope that combining this data and what we've just seen can help the negotiation. I just wanted to finish with one illustration of how you can combine the theory and the data. So this graph shows the composition of support that we have in our database. So again, this is support in 40 countries. It's support, so it's more than subsidies. And we have represented it according to the matrix that I just showed before. So you see that, for example, today, just over 20% of total support would be considered as no risk. And this is support, as I said, to management and stock assessment and monitoring at sea. And then you see that you still have more than 40%, more than 30% of total support that we would consider as potentially high risk. And then combining potentially high risk and potentially moderate risk, you get to about 60% of total support. The good news is the trends are going in the right direction. So I think we can say reform is happening or has happened, but there is still quite some scope for progress.
Thanks. And then there was the work of the facilitators on IUU, overfish and overcapacity and overfishing to refine all of those ideas down. And then in mid-2020, of course, there was quite a significant gear change in the discussions. The chair put down his text, his single text with options in it that became the focus of the negotiations. And that is where we start to see much more detailed discussions and decisions made as you went along. So Tristan's going to walk you through how that text evolved. And to start to show you where at least we think some of the key decisions were made. And he has a fantastic summary slide at the end that gives you kind of a sense of what happened across those 2 years. So let's start with the approaches. So maybe just a sort of a sense, a word on where we are now, right? Because I think the context of your overcapacity and overfishing negotiations, phase 2, is different from where you were 2 or 3 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago. So we have the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. It establishes a framework for your rules, and it deals with what we internally kind of think of as the red light, like real emergency situations. Cases of IUU fishing, subsidies to fishing where stocks are declared to be overfished, and fishing on the high seas outside the competence of an RFMO. So what's left of the problem? And at least in our mind, it's sort of orange light situations, right? It's fishing to subsidies to fishing in domestic EEZs when the fish stocks aren't declared yet to be overfished, because that's in Article 4. It's subsidies to fishing in foreign EEZs when the fish stocks aren't yet declared to be overfished. And it's subsidies to fishing within the competence of RFMOs, under the competence of RFMOs, again, where those fish stocks aren't yet declared to be overfished. The other parts of that, of the kind of overall problem, you have more or less dealt with in the agreement as it is. And maybe there are other problems to consider, but en gros, this is one way of thinking about the part of the problem that's left to resolve. So we're going to start with, I'll do the prohibitions first, and then I'll do the S&DT. Just a couple of things to remember. And the first, of course, is this question of the burden of proof. So when you think about, at least when I was thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of the different approaches, I found it was important to bear in mind and to keep at the back of our heads the concept of the burden of proof, right? Which is essentially who has to prove what in order for the rule to be enforced in a WTO dispute. And the basic rule of thumb is that the complainant has to prove a subsidy violates the prohibition, however it's constructed. And then the defendant, the government providing the subsidy, has to prove the subsidy fits within an exception or isn't covered by the prohibition. So the easier it is to prove that the prohibition applies, the more easily enforceable the rule is. I'm going to assume that's an advantage. Others may not see it that way, but that's the first assumption. And then the easier it is to prove that an exception applies, the less easily enforceable the rule is. I'm going to assume that's a disadvantage, but others may see it differently. So firstly, kind of remember the burden of proof and how that works with respect to the different approaches. And then the second really important point is that the approaches can, of course, be combined, and they usually were in proposals. So while I'm doing one approach one by one, it's slightly artificial because most of the, in fact, I think almost all the proposals that were put on the table combined the different approaches in some way, often precisely to mitigate the weaknesses of one approach with an additional approach. So this is just a reminder of the different ideas out there. Okay, the first one, many of you will be very familiar with this, a list-based prohibition, right? So the idea is to prohibit a list of particular kinds of subsidies. And those could be subsidies defined by the kinds of economic variables that subsidy targeted, like the construction or the renovation of vessels. That is the cost the subsidy is designed to get at. Or sometimes some things on the lists were defined by the kind of fishing activity it benefited. So fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Subsidies that had that objective, for example, might be the topic of a particular subsidy on that list. So advantages of the list-based prohibition, at least as I see it, relatively easy to implement in the sense that your regulation is based on the design of the subsidy, something that's quite clear to you as a government. Also, I think relatively easy to enforce in that if you're a complainant, you really need only information about the existence and the basic design of the subsidy to argue that it's on the prohibited list. Disadvantages, it is a relatively indiscriminate on its own. On its own, it is a relatively indiscriminate way of targeting subsidies in that it doesn't account for circumstances, right? Where a listed subsidy is in fact not contributing to overcapacity or overfishing. Maybe you want to accept that as a weakness of the list approach. Maybe you don't, but to be aware of it. Then there's this idea of an effect-based prohibition. And the idea here was that you would prohibit subsidies if they had a negative effect on fish stocks. And this idea could be part of or combined with a list approach. So one idea that surfaced was that subsidies that negatively affected fish stocks by reducing capital and operating costs would be prohibited. So a combination of specific kinds of subsidies and the effect that they might have. Advantages of focusing on the of designing a prohibition based on a subsidy's effect. It is quite tailored, right? It actually addresses the impact that subsidies are contributing to overcapacity and overfishing, and therefore the depletion of fish stocks. The rule addresses exactly the impact that the rules, that the mandate wants the rules to address. Disadvantages, more difficult to implement potentially, in that if you're a government looking at your subsidies, you need to have some kind of assessment of whether or if a subsidy is likely to have this negative effect on a fish stock. And again, enforcement, more challenging because a complainant would need to prove that that the subsidy is in fact having that effect. So would need to prove a causal link between the subsidy and the state of a fish stock. Now, one interesting thing, just a kind of a little parenthesis asterisk, is that there's ways of making the causal link directly, and the construction above there would do that, for example. So the construction above, the subsidies negatively affect fish stocks, essentially says that if you are providing these subsidies, we assume that because you are reducing capital and operating costs, the negative effect is what happens. So there's ways, in theory, the causal link is a difficult thing to prove. There were ideas that would essentially close that causal link and make it almost automatic. Exactly, with a list, exactly. So there was the effect-based prohibition, very tailored, but difficult to prove as a complainant that one thing exactly had that effect. Then there was the idea of a sort of a situational prohibition. And this was a prohibition of subsidies if there was overfishing or overcapacity in a fishery. And again, that could be combined with a list approach. So you could prohibit subsidies to capital or operating costs in a fishery where these conditions already existed. So the situation is what triggers the prohibition. Again, advantages, it's relatively tailored. It addresses the situations that the rules want to address, but without requiring the causal link, right? You essentially say, if the bad situation is already there, subsidies are prohibited, full stop. You don't have to prove that the subsidy is causing the condition. Disadvantages, though, in order to implement the rule as a government, you need to know whether your fishery already has overfishing or overcapacity in it to know whether you can subsidize. And secondly, if you want to enforce the rule against somebody else, you need to know whether there's overfishing or overcapacity in that other fishery. If you're sharing the fishery and you have access to all the data, perhaps you know. If you aren't sharing the fishery and don't have access to the data, it might be difficult to prove that the situation is one that's covered by the rule. So then there's this idea of a broad prohibition, so not listing specific subsidies, but simply saying essentially all subsidies are prohibited unless fisheries management is in place. And again, thinking of the burden of proof, you could draft it to make the exception, the fisheries management exception, more difficult to prove. There was text, and some of you will remember the first chair's text required that measures effectively ensure stocks are maintained at a biologically sustainable level. Or it could be drafted to make the exception easier to prove, right? Where we ended up more or less in June was that subsidies are prohibited unless measures are implemented to maintain, right? So the effectively ensure requirement wasn't there any longer. Advantages of that combination, again, it's relatively tailored. It addresses all subsidies except where the risks associated with those subsidies are being mitigated or may be mitigated. If the exception is difficult to prove, it's easier to enforce. The burden of the proof is on the subsidizer and it's harder to meet, so it's easier to enforce the rule. On the disadvantages side, again, implementation on your own requires some information, not just about subsidies, but also about your fisheries management measures and whether they meet the standard. And again, if the exception is relatively easy to prove, then the burden of proof on the subsidizing member is less. It's easier for them to access the exception, and it's harder to enforce the prohibition against a subsidy. So that it really depends on how you draft it. Another idea that surfaced was the idea of having a very broad prohibition, but something called a green box set of exceptions. And essentially there, the idea is all subsidies are prohibited unless they are in a list of exempted or green box subsidies. Green box because that's the list, that's the term used in the agriculture agreement for subsidies that you can provide. So we sort of borrowed the idea of a green box. And again, how it works really depends on how the green box is drafted. It could be drafted to make the box quite easy to fit into if it's a long list of subsidies or there are few requirements associated with it. Or it could be drafted to make the green box more difficult to fit into if it's a narrower list of subsidies and there are more safeguards. Advantages overall of this approach, again, like a list, it's essentially the reverse of a list, right? It's relatively easy to implement in that it's based only on the design of the subsidy. You know what the subsidy's objective is. If the exception, the green box, is more difficult to prove, if it's a narrow box with a narrow list and more safeguards, it's more difficult for the subsidizing member to use the exception, and it's easier to enforce against a subsidy. On the disadvantages side, again, like the positive list, it's relatively indiscriminate, right? It doesn't account for a circumstance where subsidies within the green box are in fact contributing to overcapacity or overfishing. So the same problem with the list, whether you have a positive red list or, a list of prohibited subsidies or a list of allowed subsidies. And again, if the green box is quite wide and loose, if the exception is easy to prove, it's harder to enforce against the subsidizing member because they have a lot of exception to use. So there were those two ideas of a broad prohibition plus an exception. There were a lot of different capping approaches, and many of you will remember these. The capping approaches were essentially the establishment of different kinds of quantitative limits on the total levels of subsidies that members could provide, avoiding all of the discussion about management and all of the discussion about circumstance, setting a very clear basic limit. There were different ways of doing this and different proposals. There was the idea of tiers of countries, which would be defined based on the share of global catch, and then a cap on their subsidies and a reduction for big subsidizers or big fishing nations. There was the idea of tiers based on development level, catch level, the importance of small scale fishing, and perhaps the cap as a percentage of landed value for each tier, getting a bit more sophisticated. There was another idea where members would choose what variable they would base their cap on, whether it would be their subsidies as notified, the landed value of their catch, or the global average of subsidies times the number of fishermen that they had. So that gave members much more flexibility to choose how the cap would be established. And then there were other ideas where the cap would be based on a common formula for each member, and that there would be higher reductions for bigger subsidizers. So different ways essentially of establishing a quantitative limit on those total levels of subsidies. So the advantages of a quantitative approach, there's a lot of certainty. So the bounds of each member's obligation is quite clear. It's a number. Adaptable in the sense that the level of commitment by different members can be adapted to their situation, sort of, depending on the variables you choose. And what's interesting here is that, as was raised earlier, it allows you to actually monitor and ideally enforce actual reductions in subsidy amounts, if that's what's important to you. Some advantages. Disadvantages, again, if you're setting quantitative limits on the amounts of subsidies, almost all of these approaches require data on the current levels of subsidies. And there's not a lot of data out there. Although I do remember that when the quantitative approaches were being negotiated, there was a flurry of new notifications of subsidies from members who hadn't provided them before. So it's not impossible. The data can be acquired. But again, the quantitative approach is somewhat indiscriminate, right? In that the limits don't necessarily reflect the limits of subsidies, or sorry, don't reflect the impact of subsidies in different specific circumstances. But they were there. S&DT, this is relatively quick because the approaches were simpler. So you can establish special and differential treatment exceptions from the prohibition based on specific groups of members, developing country members, least developed country members. Advantages, there's a lot of certainty. Memberships of groups is pretty clear. There's some adaptability in that members of the groups can, if they wish, declare they won't avail themselves of S&DT. So the groups aren't set in absolute concrete. Members can exclude themselves if they want to. But again, by developing country groups, it's relatively indiscriminate because fishing and subsidizing capacity varies hugely between those country groups. Then there's an idea of having sort of not political country groups, but kind of threshold defined country groups. And the idea is that the exceptions from the prohibitions would apply to groups of members that met a specific threshold, maybe based on the contribution to global fishing catch, more than or less than X%, a threshold based on the subsidies they provided, more than or less than X amount, based on fishing activities. There was an idea, countries with or without distant water fishing activities would be able to use or not use exceptions, or based on national economic statistics, GNI per capita, or the contribution of fisheries to GDP. So there were different ways of creating groups proposed. Advantages, again, implementation. Most of these thresholds can be built based on existing, more or less agreed sets of international data, sometimes with extra notifications. Adaptability in the sense that once a country no longer met that threshold, the prohibition would begin to apply. But on the other side, somewhat indiscriminate in that all of those thresholds are imperfect proxies for the degree of contribution to the global problem of subsidized overcapacity and overfishing. And the other thing which I thought was interesting when I thought about it is that all of these thresholds focus on a contribution to the global problem rather than the question of local overcapacity and overfishing. So you're constructing exceptions based on the global problem rather than thinking about sort of the effect of subsidies in a particular member's jurisdiction. Geographical area, many of you will remember this badly. So the idea is there were exceptions for the prohibitions of subsidies by developing country members fishing in specific areas, the territorial sea, the 12 nautical miles, the contiguous zone, which is in fact 12 nautical miles from the baseline, the exclusive economic zone, which is 200, and sometimes the idea of exempting subsidies from developing country members in areas and for species under the competence of RFMOs. That was one idea that surfaced. Advantages, relative clarity. All of these areas are areas that form the basis of fisheries and maritime governance. So governments are all familiar with them, and it's relatively clear how to calculate them. Most governments have done that. Disadvantages, again, somewhat indiscriminate, right? Area-based rules don't reflect extremely well the diversity of different fisheries realities. And in fact, taken all of together, most of those areas cover most global fishing, because that is in fact where fishing takes place, in exclusive economic zones next to the shore and in RFMOs for valuable, highly migratory species. So another idea was by scale of fishing activity. Many of you will remember this, exempting from the prohibition subsidies by developing country members to different scales of fishing activity. And this was often described using socioeconomic criteria like low income, resource poor, and livelihood fishing, which was I think the best set of adjectives we could find, or could be found at least in June, to identify artisanal fishing, for example. The advantages, you're trying to tailor the exceptions here to focus on particular parts of the fishing fleet or particular socioeconomic groups that you might want to continue subsidizing under different rules. Again, the disadvantages, you will all know them very well. Very difficult to develop a single set of criteria that tailors the exception adequately in different circumstances. It just is difficult. The more tailored you get, the less indiscriminate it gets. The less tailored you are, the more indiscriminate, but the easier it becomes. All of these exceptions could be modulated using time. So you can exempt from the prohibition subsidies by developing country members for different time periods. You can make an exemption permanent or temporary, and the time periods were often applied to exemptions developed on the basis of other approaches, right? A different transition period for subsidies to large scale or small scale fishing, or permanent exemptions for either or both. So again, clarity on the advantages side, an objective standard of time delimits the exemption from the obligations, and you can combine some flexibility with pressure for reform. And that, well, I suppose that is if the exemption is time limited, right? It ends at a certain point. Disadvantages, of course, as you well know, it's very difficult to agree on a single transition period to apply to very diverse fishing fleets among members. So again, the same problem, the more tailored it becomes, the less indiscriminate it becomes, but the more difficult it is to negotiate. The wider the rule or the exception, the more indiscriminate it becomes, but perhaps the easier it is to negotiate. So what else needs to be considered? In the interest of time, I'm actually going to ask Tristan to keep going along this so you can see the next part of the presentation, and then I'd be really interested in your views on what did I miss or what else was discussed. But in order to make sure that we get the next phase of the story on the table and we can come back to it, Tristan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alice. And hi, everyone. So in this second part of the presentation, we look a little bit closer actually at the 2 last years and a half in negotiations. And we'll look at how the discussions on overcapacity and overfishing evolved over time. What were the key steps as reflected in the successive versions of the text. And so we hope that will provide you with a useful review of how disciplines gradually evolved into the text that was on the table at MC12, which can then inform your reflection on how best to proceed next. So let's start with we don't see the dates of the text, so I will just mention it to you. So let's start with the June 2020 text, which was the first version essentially of the draft consolidated text. So this text was really the first attempt at proposing something that started to look like a treaty, so without countless alternatives, but rather suggesting a basis for negotiation that would eventually lead to an agreement. So this came just after the phase of discussions led by facilitators on each topic, and on that basis, the idea was to start to find some common ground. For the main prohibition, the suggested approach essentially included 2 elements. First, there was a list-based prohibition focused on subsidies that reduce operating and capital costs. And second, there was also a situational element to the main prohibition. So subsidies would be prohibited only in situations where there is overcapacity or overfishing in a fishery. And this main prohibition was already accompanied by a management exemption, allowing subsidies to continue if the subsidizing member could show that it had other policies that effectively ensured that stocks were maintained at a sustainable level. And here the words effectively ensured were in brackets already, showing that some members had expressed sensitivities about that language. So that's the overall approach that was proposed, and it was sort of a hybrid between different proposals. As Alice explained, there had been various approaches suggested for these disciplines, and they were divergent views among delegations on whether this qualitative prohibition should adopt a simple list-based approach, for example, or something more tailored, a more tailored approach taking into account the circumstances in which subsidies are provided. So the attempt here, as it was explained, was to try to find some common ground by including elements of different approaches. On special and differential treatment, the text was based on one particular proposal, but it did not yet attempt to suggest a middle ground between different positions. So under that approach, you'll see that there were 3 permanent exemptions from the prohibition. A first one for LDCs, a second one for developing country members fishing in the territorial sea, and a third one for almost all developing members fishing in the EEZ and under RFMOs. So that was under a combination of criteria. On distant water fishing, the suggested approach was already the double prohibition that is included in the pre-MC12 draft agreement. So a prohibition of subsidies contingent on fishing in areas beyond the subsidizing members' jurisdiction, as well as the unregulated high seas subsidy prohibition that was included in the agreement reached at MC12. And finally, on capping and green box, there were simply placeholders in the text. So the idea was really to focus on the qualitative prohibition and then maybe come back to those other elements. So that was really the starting point of that process. The text was then revised in November 2020, and this revision included 2 important changes, which are highlighted here in blue, and that's the principle for all slides. I've always highlighted the changes in blue so that we don't need to focus on everything, but only the blue parts, which is the changes from the previous version. So first, the overall approach for the main prohibition was changed. You'll see that we went from a list of 2 broad categories, so subsidies to operating and capital costs, to a longer list of more detailed subsidy categories, but still essentially covering the same types of programs. So no huge change here. The real change is that the situational element of the prohibition was removed. So the previous version covered some subsidies, but only in particular situations. But this new version covers the listed subsidies in all situations. And then, of course, there is still the management exemption that applies to the prohibition. So here, this change was explained mostly as an issue of simplification. So this was to avoid some redundancy because the situation in which subsidies are provided was already taken into account in the management exemption. But we see that this change also made the prohibition somewhat more automatic and easier to trigger, which may have helped to address some of the concerns from some delegations that the prohibition was too difficult to trigger with the situational element in it. The second very important change is about the management exemption. So you see that in the second row. And it has been made wider in that version of the text. In the previous version, even if it was bracketed, the language used would have explicitly required management measures to be effective for subsidies to be allowed. And in this new version, the requirement was made more permissive, simply requiring that measures are implemented to maintain stocks at a sustainable level. So the reason for that change is that some delegations expressed strong sensitivities about the previous version because it required effectiveness explicitly. So they probably felt the threshold was too high and too difficult. So these 2 changes here are really key, we think, because they occurred basically very early in the process. And then those parts of the disciplines, they remained mostly stable, at least in terms of their structure and overall approach until MC12. So that was the objective, right? It was to first try to find some common ground on the overall approach. So the prohibition, the exemption, and then to focus more on other aspects, such as SDT and distant water fishing. But this also means that the decisions that were taken here very early, because they happened early, they have influenced the next steps and the discussions on the other elements. The text was then revised in December 2020. And there are three changes here that should be noted. So first, on the management exemption, it was made again somewhat wider, but this time in a different way, because this particular change was more about making it more accessible to members who have data limited fisheries, which is often the case in developing countries. And to do that, the language, some language was introduced to clarify that the reference points used for management measures could be commensurate with the data available in a fishery. So the idea here was really to make it easier for members who have less data available and less sophisticated fisheries management systems to access that flexibility. The second change is about SDT, and it looks minor, but it also has important meaning. And it is that brackets were added around the three exemptions, and a placeholder was added for another form of transitional mechanism for the third one. So that's the one that would have been the largest exemption in terms of scope. And essentially, these changes were made to recognize that the very different views, to recognize the very different views of members on this topic. And the fact that there was no convergence on any of these exemptions. So for the first time, there's a mention of another possible approach on SDT, because the approach in the text had only been based on one particular proposal until then. So this was really the first step in the direction of an alternative. And finally, for the first time, there was also a placeholder for an exemption for access subsidies in the rules that are about distant water fishing. And this shows that sensitivities were expressed by some members on this issue already at that moment. If we now move to the next text, it's quite an important one, right? Because that's the new version of the draft consolidated text that came in 2021 in May, and it's an important inflection point in the process because it really marks a shift in the main focus from the general approach to the disciplines, so the prohibition, the management exemption, towards S&D provisions and more discussions on these. But as we see, there's still one important change regarding the management exemption here, and that change is the introduction of that link with transparency requirements. So making the fulfillment of such transparency requirements a condition to benefit from that flexibility. And here we have a change that made accessing this exemption a little bit more demanding. And this was explained as responding to calls from a number of members to introduce that link. So it seems there was no broad appetite to really revisit the overall level of permissiveness of the exemption, but there was still a desire by some delegations to make the use of this exemption more transparent. Moving to SDT, this is really where the most important change happened with the introduction of an alternative approach proposed by the chair. So recognizing that convergence had not been possible on the previous version, another approach was introduced. But we also see that it had some similarities with the previous version, right? So it also included an exemption for LDCs. Then instead of an exemption for all fishing in the territorial sea, it included an exemption for artisanal fishing in the territorial sea with a suggested time limitation in brackets. And it's on the third element that the approach differed most significantly. So regarding fishing in the domestic EZ and under RFMOs, here, instead of a complete exemption for almost all developing countries, it included a suggested transition period for all developing countries. So, so the time period of 5 years was suggested in bracket. And there was also a possible extensions of these transition periods for members who are both small fishing nations and also small subsidizers. And finally, the suggested approach was also linked to transparency. So only notified subsidies could have benefited from SDT exemptions. So this change here is really important because it provides the basis on which all further discussions on SDT were based. So that's an important step. And the attempt here was to try to find some kind of middle ground, or to start to find some kind of middle ground between members' very different positions on this issue. And to do so, the movement from the previous SDT language was a suggested narrowing of some of the prohibitions, except for LDCs. So we'll see on the next slides how this further evolved. Quickly on contingent subsidies, contingent on distant water fishing, we also see that the placeholder become a proper exemption for access subsidies, which would have applied if management measures were in place. So again, this reflects the sensitivities of some members. And finally, a last important change here is that the placeholders for capping and a possible green box were completely removed. So, so this was explained as the result of the progress, essentially, that had been achieved on the qualitative prohibition, and probably the fact that this approach was thought as the most likely to lead to an outcome. This text was then revised in June 2021. And from there, we'll see that discussions and changes to the text really focused on two elements. So SDT provisions and the rules on subsidies that are contingent on distant water fishing. But the overall approach was pretty much stable. So on SDT, the steps that occurred from there were in the direction of a gradual widening of the exemptions and also a few other adjustments. So the dynamic here was that a number of developing country members expressed the view that the text was not balanced. So as a result, they called for SDT provisions that would give them more flexibility to provide subsidies. And so we can see the first step in that direction, in that process, in this June 2021 text, which suggested to make the artisanal exemption permanent. So you can see that change in blue here on the screen. You'll see that there is another small change regarding the prohibition of subsidies that are contingent on distant water fishing, where the exemption was bracketed. So again, showing that there was no agreement and there was really debate on how strictly it should apply or what type of exception should apply to the rule. This text was then revised in 2021, November 2021. And so if we move to that revision, we see kind of the continuation of the same trend on SDT, right? Because here the key step is really the addition of another flexibility in the form of the so-called de minimis exemption. So a permanent exemption for relatively small fishing nations. And here again, the dynamic is that of a widening of SDT provisions. Some brackets were also added around 12 nautical miles for the artisanal exemption, showing that there were divergences of views around that limit. And for the transition period for the EEZ and for RFMO fishing, there was no suggested number anymore in the text because members had very different views on this, so there was just an X. Another important change was the addition of a best endeavor obligation with the SDT provisions, which required that members using those SDT exemptions shall endeavor to ensure that subsidies did not contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. So with the widening of SDT, the idea here was to have some level of commitment to sustainability, even in a very soft way. So that's why it was introduced and that's how it was explained. Finally, the other important change in that revision was the move of the subsidy prohibition for contingent subsidies, subsidies contingent on distant water fishing to the main prohibition. So the effect of this was to make it subject to the broader management exemption as well as SDT provisions. And so here again, there were strong divergences of views, and with some, and there were some members strongly in favor of completely removing that rule. So this move was explained as an attempt to find some kind of compromise solution on that particular rule. Maybe this one very quickly, that's the November text that was tabled just before MC12 was expected to take place in November. The only real substantive change that was suggested in that version of the text was the addition of that footnote to clarify that developing members who are very large fishing nations with the number of 10% of global fishing would not be able to access SDT flexibilities. But it was kept in brackets to reflect that there was no agreement on the ID. And we now come to the last version of the text, and probably the one you remember the most, which is the one that was on the table at MC12. And here again, the most important changes are really on SDT. And also on subsidies contingent on distant water fishing. On SDT, this revision is really the most detailed and sophisticated attempt to date to find some kind of landing zone for these provisions. And so here again, there was some level of widening of the provisions, but more through smaller adjustments in the suggested numbers. So for the de minimis exemption, the number went from 0.7% to 0.8%. For the artisanal exemption, the 24 nautical miles option was added. And on the transition period, there was no suggested number in the previous version. So two options were introduced here, which you see here in brackets. Regarding contingent subsidies, the move was to take this rule back out of the main prohibition. And so again, it shows the divergences of views among members and this kind of back and forth between more exemptions and less exemptions. It shows that it was really a contested rule and members really did not agree on how strictly it should apply or the type of exemptions that should apply to that rule. Okay, so that was quite a bit of substance. So what I've attempted to do with this slide is to provide you with a summary of the key milestones in that process. As you see, the table divides the process into two broad phases. So the first one, 2020, and the second one, 2021, 2022. And you'll see in the table a summary of what happened on the various parts of the disciplines in these two phases. I've also highlighted in red the cells that include the most important steps. And what this shows is that in each of those two broad periods, the discussions and the resulting changes in the text were focused on different parts of the disciplines. It also sheds light on how changes in the first period then may have affected and influenced changes in the second period. So if we look at 2020, the main steps of the process were really about the overall approach. So the main prohibition, the management exemption. And as we've seen, there are two important steps that occurred quite early in the process. So first, this move from an approach that had a list and a situational element to another approach that had only a list. So here the movement essentially made the prohibition both simpler and somewhat more automatic. And this also came with another important change regarding the management exemption. And these two changes should be looked at together, right? So in a parallel move, the management exemption was made wider in two ways. First, it became less strict by using more permissive language. So we've seen that initially it required management measures to have effectiveness, to be for subsidies to be allowed, and then we moved to some language that was less strict, only requiring measures to be implemented to maintain stocks at a sustainable level. And second, there was also the change that made the exemption more accessible with the addition of the language on reference points and specifying that reference point could be commensurate with the data available in a fishery. So prohibition simpler and more automatic. At the same time, management flexibility wider. And of course, that shows what some members were pushing for in that phase. And these changes are really important because in the following phase, in 2021 and 2022, these two key parts of the discipline remained pretty much stable, as we see on the right of the table. On the main prohibition, there was only this question of whether the rule on subsidies that are contingent on distant water fishing should be included in it, but the overall approach did not change. And for the flexibility, there was the addition of the link with transparency requirements, which is important, but the exemption itself did not change further. So these are really the key steps for the first phase. On the rest of the disciplines, so SDT, distant water fishing, capping, and green box, there were no significant steps, and that's because there was an explicit focus on the qualitative prohibition and the general approach. So yeah, there were some discussions on SDT, including those led by the friend of the chair, but this did not yet materialize in any visible movement in the text. If we now turn to the second phase, so 2021 and 2022, there we see that most of the movements and the key steps really happened in those other parts of the disciplines, and in particular on SDT, as well as on distant water fishing. So here we'll see that there is a link between those changes and earlier developments in 2020. The first key step on SDT, which happened quite early in 2021, was in the May text, and it was this attempt by the chair to propose an alternative approach on SDT and to start finding some common ground. And then from that point, from the point this approach was tabled, what we saw over the period was essentially a gradual widening of the SDT provisions, as well as some other adjustments in those provisions. And this came, at least to some extent, as a response to some of the decisions made in the first period. So given the widening of the management exemption that had happened earlier, and given the fact that this exemption was for everyone, so it would have benefited also developed members, a number of developing members expressed the view that SDT should provide more flexibility to them. And so this push for widening SDT flexibilities should really be interpreted in light of the widening of the management exemption that happened earlier. From that perspective, we can see the widening of SDT flexibilities, or it was seen by those delegations as a way to rebalance a text that they thought was not balanced. And maybe here a related note is that adding this transparency requirement to the management exemption can also be interpreted as an attempt to adjust the balance in the text to some extent by making the use of the management exemption somewhat more demanding. Then on distant water fishing, as we've seen, the key question on that period was really the type of exemption, if any, that should apply to the rule. So first, there was the addition of an exemption for access subsidies subject to management. Then there was a move to the main prohibition, making it subject to the overall management exemption and to SDT provisions. And then it was moved back out. So what this shows is really that there were competing views among members regarding how it should apply and what type of exemption should apply. Finally, on capping and green box, we don't see much actually on this table, except that those two pieces, those two placeholders, disappeared at some point, and this really reflects an acknowledgement that a qualitative discipline using the hybrid approach was the most likely outcome. So the decision was to exclusively focus on that. And that's about it for this presentation. I'm sorry if that was quite a lot of substance to absorb. We'll distribute the slides so you can have a detailed look at that. But we'll also be very curious to know if you have any comments, remarks, questions. Because as Alice said, right, we were not in the negotiating rooms, so all of this is our take on what we think the process was in an objective way, but we never had really first-hand information, right? So, so yeah, with that caveat, I give it back to you, Alice.
Super. Thank you, Tristan. Even though I wasn't in the room, when I saw this slide, I kind of felt like my whole life for 2 years had been explained, and the whole process suddenly it all came flooding back. But I think in particular, the summary slide is extremely helpful, at least for me, to just see the decision points that were made, even dividing it just in 2 phases, I thought was very helpful. So we have a bit of time for discussion, questions, comments.